Hi, I'm Stendahl, and one of the questions I get asked the most by my students in watercolor or gouache is how do I manage my water? They're in both situations getting very weak saturation, low saturation, a lot of watery colors, and they're unhappy with that. And so when I was doing Patreon, I talked quite a lot about this with my students, and I made a video that dealt with a portion of this. And you're seeing a re-edited version of that because I wanted to add some things to it and making it public. The reason I'm making it public is because one of my close friends, who's a fabulous landscape artist and knows how to work watercolors and oil paints and pastels, complains to me on a regular basis that she has trouble managing the water levels in gouache and constantly says, I don't understand how you do it. And I always say, well, come over. She only lives a few miles away. I say, come over, watch me paint, we'll talk about it. And so it sort of came to a head recently where she really wants to grasp this. And so I went digging through my archives and I found this video to send to her and a couple other videos preparatory to her coming over and working on this. Now, I'm going to put this on my blog, and I'm going to have a blog post with the other things I told her about how I thought she should approach really finely taking grasp of how to use gouache or how to use regular watercolor opaquely, which you all know from looking at my blog, or if you're past students, you've all seen me just use watercolor opaquely. So you can do it either way, but it starts with working with quality paints that re-wet well if they're dried, either from the tube or if you're working in pans, and that can get a high saturation of color. And there was something that I left out of the original video because I discussed it in other videos with my students, and that was how to set up your tubs of water. So what I'm going to do now is in the front here, I'm going to add some material and then go into the rest of the video as it was. And I hope that you'll watch this and learn about what you can do to easily get saturated colors, whether you want to work transparently in watercolor or you want to work opaquely in watercolor or you want to work opaquely in gouache. And you can work translucently in gouache too. If you want to do that, you've certainly seen me do that in some of my watercolors, especially in 2000 when I had shoulder issues. I only wanted to carry one palette around with me when I was out and about. You can see a lot of my work then on toned paper and stuff was just translucent water or gouache. So if you have a good quality gouache. So I'll also say something about brands. And but I'm going to show you the water stuff and other stuff first, and then you can go into the actual seeing of me mixing the water. And I hope that you practice this and take all the little points into consideration, because it's like riding a bike. You don't just jump on and start pedaling. You have to learn the balance of it, and you have to learn the cadence of pedaling and shifting gears, or you're just going to go flying off. And one of the things about this is that if you take it slow at first and you do things in a methodical way, dip your brush, shake your brush if that's what you're going to do. Charles Reed is famous for shaking his brush and getting little splats of paint all over his watercolors. And I know a lot of other artists, also shake their brushes and stuff. But whatever it is, get that ritual down. Go slowly at first so you do get that ritual, and it will become second nature. And it will become so second nature that you don't even talk to people about it all of the time. I was surprised when I watched this video to make sure it was appropriate to send to my friend that she would get the information she needed, that I had not stopped and specifically mentioned all of this stuff again. And I realized after I sent it to her, the reason I hadn't mentioned it is because I'd already mentioned it to the students in other videos. So now I'm trying to get it all into one thing, and we'll see how we go. The first thing I want to talk about is brands of gouache. Everybody knows, I think everybody on the planet, because I have talked since the 90s, I have done so much promotion, not paid, but just because I am personally, enthusiastically in love with Schminke's Horadam gouache. It's their artist quality line. It has artist pigments, all of the materials in it, the gum arabic, etc., all artist quality, a rich pigment load. It's just absolutely the most wonderful gouache I've ever used in my life. And believe me, I've used a lot of gouache in my life, starting from childhood. You name a brand, I've probably tried it unless it's been created recently. I haven't tried Marie's, there's a couple others that I maybe haven't tried. But this is just a stellar brand. And a lot of people tell me that it's too expensive for them to use. I understand art supply economy. I am a proponent of everyone sitting down, looking at their finances, looking at their art habit, or if they're a professional, looking at their art costs so that they know what those costs are and they can build their costs into the charges that they make to their clients so they can get paid for all this stuff. So I understand cost. The thing is, there's something that is a false economy. If you use cheap gouache, you are going to have a difficult time getting results that are really stunning and beautiful, and you're going to be frustrated and you're going to give up. And there's going to be so many fillers and opacifiers in those cheap paints that when you go to mix your colors, they're going to be dull and they're going to look dead and murky. And that's not going to happen with these. So I want you to think about that when you make your choices. A palette of 6 to 10 nice gouache selection in Schminke. I haven't looked at current prices, but it will be a little bit over $100 in the U.S. But it will really, 6 colors won't cost you as much as that. But you can really do a lot with it, especially when you're learning, and you don't need to have more than that. For people in Germany and in Europe, I understand that Schminke gouache is less expensive than Daniel Smith, which is a new line of paints that Daniel Smith has released, their own gouache line. And that is a artist quality paint. I don't have any with me right here. I have tried it. I don't like the texture of it and the way it mixes as much as I like Schminke gouache. So I haven't done as much testing of it. I put it aside after my initial test. It wasn't something I fell immediately in love with. Doesn't mean I don't think Daniel Smith has created a great gouache. It's a lovely paint, and I look forward to testing it more. But I know that one of my friends in England loves Daniel Smith's gouache, but it's more expensive for her there because of shipping costs and whatnot than Schminke gouache. So it's going to depend, cost is going to depend on where you live a little bit. But take into account that you want the artist quality line of any paint line, and if it says Academy in it or has some other nomenclature that says it's not artist quality, then you'll know that the pigments are going to be of lesser quality, and there's going to be a lesser amount of them in the paint, and you're going to have some more struggle with it. Now, the other gouache paint that I use periodically is Holbein Artist's Gouache, and here are some colors in that line. One of the reasons I don't like these as much, they're very opaque, and usually they're so opaque because most of the colors have already been tinted for you, which means they've already had the white pigments added to them. And you can find this, if you don't know this, you can find this by reading the labels. And somewhere in here, I'm not seeing it right away, but on the label it will lists the pigment numbers, and you look for PW. Oh, here it is. My eyes are kind of bad. PW6. So it's got pigment red 209, I think, in here, and pigment white 6. So right away we know there's white paint in this. Why am I a little bit less enthralled about using paints that already have white paint in them? What I find is that too much white paint in a gouache painting really gives you kind of a zombie look, and or gives you an overly bright saccharine look. And I'm not a saccharine person, and I don't like that look myself. There are artists that make that work and whose art I enjoy seeing, and I love that, but that's not me. So just take that into account if you're going to be looking at this paint and read your labels. I find that also paint that already has white in it mixes murkier than pigments that don't, like Schmincke. Most of their colors, I don't have all of their colors, so I can't say that every single one doesn't have white pigment in it, but most of them are single pigment paints, and they don't have white paint, and they just, when you mix them, it mixes like watercolors. You don't get murkiness. And then you can add to your mix, you can add the amount of white you want, and you can add zinc white if you want a more translucent white. You can add titanium white if you want a more opaque paint. So you can really play with things because you're working from the ground up, and it's not already all done for you, and you have to work with what you've got. What you'll basically see me use these for 90% of the time is for backgrounds. Whether I paint a portrait or a subject in watercolor, or I just do a sketch, I often like to color my backgrounds. And before Montana markers were around, so certainly in the early 2000s, certainly in the 90s in studio work and stuff, you would see me use these for backgrounds because they are so opaque. If I want a tint that's already mixed, it's often the end of the day and I don't want to mix things, and I'll just get a tube and put it on. But I use basically the same pigments, so I am trying to be aware of color harmony. So I'll pick, if I'm going to use certain colors with a Schmincke in my subject, then what I will do is I will pick a background that goes with those pigments. And so then there's some comparison of pigments in the tubes and so on, and I'll think about that. And that way keep the color harmony going. But again, it's a matter of taste and things that you want to do, but now you've sort of got an idea of my two favorite brands of gouache. So we're talking about water management, and the palette that you use actually influences your water management. So when I'm in the studio, I normally have something like this, the Stay Wet palette from Masterson. I actually have a much bigger one, but it would take up all my space here for the camera, so I'm just showing you the small one. And the lid pops off. I always have trouble getting the lid off. And inside we have a sponge. This all comes with the box, and you can get refill sponges. You get a little sponge like this, specially made for the box, and then you get a special paper that you put in water in the microwave. There's instructions on how to do this for a certain period of time, like 1 minute or something, and it absorbs, it hyper-absorbs the water, and you have this slightly damp, not sopping wet, that doesn't work as well, but squeeze the water out, but it's damp sponge, the bottom. Put this, after it's been hydrated, on top here, and then you lay out your paints in the order that you like to have them in your palette. And then I usually leave an area down here so that I can reach up here with my brush and mix my colors down here. And the moisture from the sponge will come up through the paper, and together the two of those things will keep the paints moist and keep you from developing a skin on your paints. And so they'll last obviously longer. They won't dry out on you. They'll be fresh, just like they're from the tube, for a longer period of time. When you're through with your session, all you have to do is just put the lid back on the box and close it up and walk away. I would caution you to not keep your paints in one of these for over 2 weeks. I have gone 3 weeks for a particular job that I was working on where I wanted all the colors to be built up and used in a certain way. But around about 2 weeks, there's a possibility, depending on your environment and your climate, that you can get mold. And then you would have to hyper clean the box and clean your brushes, and that's all a big deal. So I don't recommend it. Because I've been doing this whole water control thing for a long time, and because I've been moving for a number of years now, my stuff has been in storage, and I haven't had all access to everything. I won't say that I get lazy, but I just oftentimes will set things out on a regular palette. And this was one I was using for several days with certain colors. And then I would mix in the spaces in between. And then it got finally too gunky even for me, and I washed it. But I can still use these, even though these are rock solid. This is Schmenke paint. One of these over here is a Iridori gouache from Holbein. But I can reconstitute these. I don't find that Holbein reconstitutes as well when you re-wet it as Schmenke does, and as does M. Graham, which is another paint which I didn't mention earlier. But it's still a good paint, and Holbein will still reconstitute. But I usually just have it on this, and then what I do is I get a spray bottle like this, and as you'll see in the other video when I talk about more on water management, you'll see what's happening. But that's the other thing I do, is I place things on this kind of plate. Now, in between sessions, what I'll frequently do is I will put it in a plastic bag. I'll get a Ziploc bag that is big enough to slide this in. And actually, Hefty makes one with a zipper on it, and it's very easy open and close. And it comes in a jumbo size, and I would get one of those. Those are still in storage, so I can't show you one. And then I would just slide this in. And typically what I do is I have something, I'm not going to use this, but I have something, it's a little paint jar. And I can stick it right here, and this will hold the plastic up off of the top of all this fresh paint, because at that point it's fresh paint, soft paint, and sticking it in and out of the plastic bag is just going to smear this stuff. So you want to put this, some kind of spacer that's water resistant, and I find those little plastic paint cups work fine. The other thing that you can do is you can get a board that is about 2 inches bigger on all sides and still fits in whatever bag you're going to put it in. And you can place this on there, and you can cut paper towel rolls in half and duct tape or packing tape down half of one of those halves of the paper towel roll, or toilet paper roll, in each of your corners. And then you can sit this on the board, and then you can slide the whole thing into the plastic bag, and those 4 corner posts will hold the plastic bag off of this surface. It just makes it easier for using if you don't have to get this color out of this color and so on. But oftentimes these days, because things are still kind of broken up here with time and access to tools and whatnot, I'll leave these out, let them dry, and I'll just reconstitute it on the fly. Another thing you can do, and this is an old illustrator's trick, if you don't have a Stay Wet palette, you can use, again, a china plate that you buy inexpensively at warehouse sales and only use for your paints. And you can get paper towel. I like Bounty paper towel. Their higher end paper towel I find is really resilient, and I can use it for a long time before I have to replace it. And you can use that in lieu of a sponge, so you can get this damp. And then you can just take regular tracing paper, and this comes in pads, and you can cut a piece to fit. This is actually a half a sheet and then a little bit cut off. It fits perfectly on this plate. And put that on your wet paper towel, and then put your colors out. Boom, boom, boom. And mix here and so on. This would be if I was using a smaller palette, obviously, because I won't have as much room for mixing. So that's something else that you can do. And you can put something smaller like this. You can put it into some of those inexpensive plastic containers for food made by Glad and Ziploc now that are competing with Tupperware. You would never do this with a Tupperware because they're so expensive. I don't know that they're made anymore, but the point is Glad and Ziploc wanted to get part of that market, and they Rubbermaid also did, and they've created these extra large containers that you can take things like lasagna and batches of cookies to holiday parties, and you can leave the containers and forget them, and they only cost a few dollars, and if you don't get them back, there's no friendships broken up over it. And so this is something that you can take these smaller plates and you can put it in one of those boxes and close it up, and you've essentially made your own Stay Wet palette. Stay Wet palette, incidentally, with the sponge is ideal if you want to work in acrylics or if you're using acrylic gouache, because they really do well on the Stay Wet palette system. If you're working from a box palette with pans and you've dispensed your gouache into the pans, and this is watercolor, but my gouache pan setup is still packed, you can do that and keep it fresh, or you can also do it and let it dry. And I found with Schmenke paints, they re-wet very well in a pan situation. So I have a pan set up like this with my Schmenke gouache from tubes, because they don't make pans of their gouache. And I fill it up 1/3 and let it dry, and I fill up the pan 2/3 and let it dry, and then I fill up the third part of the pan and let it dry. When it's all dry, I just take it and go. And when I get to where I'm going to sketch, I open it up, I spritz it all with just a little light layer, and I think I talk about this in the original video, and go. But this is the kind of pan that it would be in, and what I don't think I talk about in the other part of the video is that I will take with this a little bit of paper towel, and I'll fold it and I'll put it in the box before I close it up so it'll stay fresh while I'm sketching. And then when I open it up, it's fine. When I'm going to the next animal enclosure or a place that I'm going to be sketching, if I'm at the zoo or wherever, then I will put that back in and close it up. And if it is spritzed, you want to hold it upright as you're walking around so that you don't, cause your liquid paints to slide around. Another palette that I'm quite fond of for gouache, whether I dry it or use it fresh, is a little Whiskey Painter's palette, and that's what this is. And they're very snug. You saw how snug that was, okay? And so if I'm going to use this to take gouache into the field, I will fill this little channel here comes out, and then you can take these pans out if you want to switch out the colors that you're using, or if you want to put in a full pan instead of half pans, you can do that. And then you just push this back in, and everything's nice and snug, and they don't fall out. Now, if I'm going to use fresh gouache in the field, I'll put it in a case like this. I'll fill these in the morning before I go, and then I'll put in my little piece of wet paper towel, and I'll close it up, and off I'll go. And I will keep this upright in my hand as I am going walking and going to the places I want to sketch, just because the paint is super fresh and moist. This just eliminates the need to carry fresh tubes of paint in my pack, because I'm trying to minimize what I'm carrying. If you've ever sketched all day long somewhere, you don't want to carry a ton of stuff, and this minimizes it if you don't have to bring your tubes along. But that way you have fresh gouache to use when you're out and about. I also do this little piece, and I don't know if I mentioned it, so I'm just going to mention it now. I do put a little piece of wet paper towel on a palette like this before I put it in a bag. But it's usually pretty moist when I put it in, but I like to do that little extra bit. I wanted to say something about brushes also before we get into everything else. Oh, and I do think you need a water bottle. This is a nice size one from Holbein, and I have a mini mister, which looks like a lipstick sized thing, and you can spritz with that, but I don't know where that's rolled off to. You've heard me talk, I'm sure if you've watched any of my videos, you've heard me talk about the kinds of paintbrushes I like. I would suggest for gouache, I do tend to keep my brushes segregated in the sense that I have the same brands and the same numbers, size numbers and everything that I use for watercolor, but then I also have the ones that I like of the whole range of brushes that I use. The ones that I like to use for gouache just get used for gouache in the studio. And the reason that is because gouache is ground more coarsely, and you sometimes can get bits of it drying in there. It's still water soluble, but it can dry in there, and you can think that you've cleaned your brush really well. But the most disappointing thing to happen when you're painting and doing a graduated wash that's turning out beautifully and is a wonderful sunset or a sunrise, whatever, and it's just working perfectly, and then all of a sudden a big chunk of paint falls out of your brush, so which would ruin it because you can't pick it out. So I keep my brushes separate for different media. It's not a hard and fast rule, even for me, but I do keep some brushes separate, and I wanted to point that out to you. What I don't do is I don't use real hair brushes, sables, or anything that's real quality as far as natural hair for painting with gouache. And the reason I don't is because I find that the new range of synthetics that are available to us now have better spring for gouache painting the way I paint, and also have better durability, and they are much less expensive. So I can go through a brush like this in a couple paintings and totally ruin it. It's starting to get what I call the Marlo Thomas look. It's got the that girl little hair curl on either side of this flat brush. The hairs are starting to curl away from the tackiness of the paint pulling in and my strokes and so on, and my changing direction quickly. And I like that in that I can keep using this brush even though it is damaged or degraded in that way, but it still has that spring. And so I get a lot of work out of one of these, and they're fairly inexpensive. They also have lovely spring and pushback that I like. So take that into account. I would keep your good sable brushes, your expensive brushes for your watercolor, and then I would use synthetics and less expensive brushes for this. Okay, now here's the most important thing that I frequently dealt with my students, but it was not in the original reconstituting dry paint video, and I wanted to include it. And that is how to do the water in your brush and manage your buckets of water. And the problem with that is that always, because of the tight space I have to film in, they always had to be off to the side. And in fact, most of the paintings that I do or have done that were filmed this way had to be done with one bucket of water because I didn't have enough space to use two. But ideally, you would always have 2 buckets of water. One would be clean, and you can use jars, you can use whatever you want. I use yogurt containers, and we eat a lot of yogurt. We always have these containers. This one happens to be 20 years old, so we use them for all sorts of things here. But you could use glass jars. You can use, I see some people using cups and whatnot. I think there's a danger with that because you might inadvertently drink from the cup or the glass, and that would not be good for you. Whereas there's no danger of me picking this up and having a chug of it, so that's not going to happen. So just keep that in mind when you choose. There's lots of fancy water buckets around that cost a lot of money and do things like dangle your brushes still in the water. And that's good if you're working with acrylic paint, but it's not necessary when you're working with watercolor paints. Your water brushes can sit off at the side after you've used them. You can, quickly rinse them. Not the final rinse, you would do that when you're done painting, but you can quickly rinse them and set them aside on a paper towel or a sponge, and they're perfectly happy. You don't want to ever store them in the bucket of water brush down because it's going to damage your brush. And you don't want to put them wet into a container upright because then all the liquid goes from the brush into the ferrule, which is that metal bit, and the wood that's clamped on, the metal's clamped onto, will swell and shrink and swell and shrink, and pretty soon this gets loose and it pops off. So you don't want to do that. So they can just sit there happily, a little wet, and then at the end of your painting session, you can wash them out, either with just a good rinse with water, or you can use one of the available artist soaps if you so desire. But so here's your 2 buckets of water, and one's always going to be clean and one's going to be dirty. I don't have a lot of this stuff out because stuff is still packed, as I've said, and so both of my buckets look pretty dirty, but we're going to pretend the left is dirty water and the right is clean water. And you want to also always look at the edge of your bucket or your glass jar or whatever. If it's collecting paint pigment, you want to clean that off periodically, because what's going to happen, and you can see this best with a round brush, is you're going to get it wet. So you're going to go in here, you're going to get it wet, and then you're going to bring it up here and you're going to run it across the edge, pressing down lightly, and you saw that little drip run into the bucket. So we'll do that again. Of course, that time you couldn't see it, but there we go. We saw that little water plunk in there. And that's we're getting the excess water there, because when you see what I do with the mixing in the video portion that's coming up, if you take this wet brush and it's full of water now and you just start going into your mixes, you're going to have the same dilution problem you already have. And that's what I see my students do in classes. So this is the ritual that you want to develop. Rinse in the dirty water. Then you want to put your brush on your paper towel or your sponge and pull it away from the tip so that you're not pushing the hairs in the wrong direction. And you want to get the excess water off of it. And then you want to put clean water in your brush by dipping it in and pushing it along the edge of a clean lip and causing the excess water to drop down. If it's still too much water, and what do you say, when you just are learning how much is too much water, you won't know yet. But when you do learn and you understand what's too much water, if there's excess, you can pat it out here. But right now we're just going to run along here so there's a ton of water in there. And then we're going to put it in our paint mix, either our pan or whatever. If you are going, and then it won't be extra diluted. If you're going to take clean water on your brush and transport it to your pan or to your blob of paint on your palette in order to reconstitute it into something you can paint with, you don't have to brush the excess. You don't have to do that part, brushing the excess off at the lip of the jar. You can just dip it in, clean brush, dip it in, and carry it to your palette. Okay? But remember, you're going to clean your dirty brush, get some of that excess off of there. You're going to then clean it by pulling it along your sponge or your paper towel. Then you're going to dip it into your clean water. You're going to lift it up, and if you're not adding water to the palette, you're going to lift it up and drag it along the edge so that the excess water falls down into there and is not on your brush. And if you want it even drier still, you can go along here again, but there's still water in there, and then you can go to your paint. But it's a clean brush that you're taking to your paint. The other thing is that after you have the paint on it, if it seems like it's too liquid, we'll just pretend there's some paint on here, you can take your paper towel and you can put the edge of the paper towel just against the brush, the base of the hairs, right next to the ferrule, which is that metal portion that holds it in. Sometimes in some brushes there'll be some wire and some goose quill and stuff to hold it all in, which is what they used to do before they had the metal on there. But you'll hold it right there at the base of the hairs, and it'll just wick the excess moisture out of that. And some pigment will come out here, but there'll still be a lot of pigment on your brush. And you'll see me do that all the time in my videos. If I feel that there's too much liquid there, I just put the paper towel right next to that. Now, sometimes you don't see it in my videos because it's off camera. And that's why I'm making such a point about it. So the big takeaway today is that you want to have a ritual about this so that you don't just randomly add dirty water or excess water to your pigments. Okay? That's the key thing. So once again, clean the dirty brush in the dirty water. Get the excess water off. Run it along your paper towel or sponge so that you're reinforcing the point and not dragging hairs away from the point. And then when it's done and it's been mopped off, then you can stick it in the clean water, and you can pick up water and drop that water on your palette. Or if you're ready to paint because your paint is already reconstituted and waiting for you, you dip it in here and you drag it along the lip there. Let the excess slide off. Take a little more excess off here so you aren't diluting your paint. Go into your paint and start painting. Very, very important, because otherwise all the stuff I'm going to be talking about next is going to be for naught, because you're just adding more and more water, and sometimes dirty water, to the paint that you're trying to get and achieve a certain saturation with. Okay? So it seems like it's a big deal. And that's why I've said it, 5, 6 times. Dip in the dirty water, clean your brush. On the lip, get the excess off. On your sponge or paper towel here, dip in, take clean water to your paint, or get excess water off this brush now because you've got your paint already mixed for yourself. And when that's the way you want it with water, dip it in your mixed paint that's all ready to go, you're at the saturation that you like. And we're going to talk about that next. But again, it's really only a couple of steps. And what happens is if you do it this way over and over and over again, it becomes second nature. People will be walking up to me, we'll be having conversations about all sorts of things, and I'll be painting, and I'll be doing this with my brush to get excess water when I want to keep the pigment at the end, and I'll be doing all these things that you're hearing me say right now, and I won't even be thinking about those things. It's totally automatic, and that's what I want for you too. So now we're going to look and talk about water levels and other things related to this, but you won't see any of this happening because my space for work, for filming, is not large enough. But you know that all of this I've just talked about is happening off screen, and that's what I want you to know so you can have the best possible result. So with that extra material, we'll go right into what was the original video and talk about handling water. Hi, this is Stendahl, and it's April 3rd, 2023. And I am taping this for my Patreon group. I am going to show you how to reconstitute dried tube color and factory pans. Because in the video I recently did, I used fresh tube color. But this tube color is now dry. So we're going to reconstitute it, both for the purposes of how you would paint, but also with the eye to doing color swatches, which is what I've been discussing, color swatches for mixing that is actually saturated enough to be useful when you're trying to work out what is the color doing with the other colors. This is a mini mister. They come from Ranger, and I like to have them in my purse. You can get the bigger little, they're still small spray bottles, and I actually prefer those. Unfortunately, the only ones I could find were parts. I didn't have enough parts to make a working one, so I don't know what's going on there, but usually I have 5 or 6 of them, so they have just run away from home, I guess, because everything else is in storage. And anyway, so you can certainly use that. And you can use a big mister if you want. That's not the problem or the issue. You can also squeeze from your brush. Just hold the brush over the pan and squeeze so 2 or 3 drops fall into the pan. I'm going to zoom in, see if we can show you water levels. That's as close as I can go. So let's start with, remember that color was gummy, so we'll just leave that, but we'll go for this one. I'm going to take some clean water, and I can touch it to that or drop it on there. If I want to keep the rest of my water clean, I can just drop it on there. Maybe 4 or 5 drops. That should soften up nicely. You can also spray your paint. Spray this one next to it. Well, let's spray this. We'll spray this blue one. I'm trying to see how I could hold it so you could see. It's not starting yet. I have to spray off to the side. So you saw one little spray, 2 little sprays, 3 little sprays is more than enough. It's already dissolved. This is Daniel Smith paint, and it dissolves and re-wets very nicely. It's one of the reasons I use it both as a tube paint and to make handmade pans. I don't like their factory-made pans. They don't re-wet nicely, in my experience, and so I didn't. But you want to just get this going here. More saturation there. But you can see how nice, and that's totally, oops, that's totally saturated at a nice level that we want, and it's great. Okay. Meanwhile, this one here, we just need to slur it around a little bit. And even within a brand, some are going to re-wet better than others or faster than others. You learn your paints and you learn what they need. That's totally okay. So that was pretty simple. I didn't have to wait any time at all. It just went, let's just, for purposes of argument, let's look at this as a more, nope, it's still going to be easy. The reason I wanted to try this one, this is a little more opaque and it's clumpier, but it's still re-wetting very nicely. Okay. I don't have enough space here to show you everything. Okay, so those are those colors. It shouldn't be a problem. If you don't get something that re-wets as easily as this, they might be a little bit drier still. Maybe they're, these feel totally dry all the way through. So I'm not thinking that's the point, but if, they have only been totally dried for a couple of days. So it could be that something could be drier for you and you might have more trouble reactivating them. But with a brand like Daniel Smith, they should re-wet fairly quickly with just those couple of squirts of water sitting for less than 30 seconds on them. Okay, so what I do with pans is I go out sketching, I sit down to sketch, and I spray the pans so that there's an even glisten along the top of everything. Okay, they're not wet in the sense that I can tilt them and stuff is going to run out of them. They're not that wet. They're just the whole surface is wet. And then I find that in the purpose of very few seconds, this one, and these are Schmenke pans, so this is different. This one's all ready to go in just those few seconds. But usually what happens is I spray them, and then that's the way watercolor should be. You shouldn't be getting pale color. You want to get, here's the reason why. You want to get, every time you touch in here, you want to get a brush full of color, either to put it on your paper as a nice saturated color because that's the way you want to paint. So it looks like that. Or you want to get a big boatload of color. I added more water to that because I'd used the initial thing up. Because you want to put it somewhere on your palette and move a sufficient quantity over there. See that nice saturated color? I want to get as much of this off the brush now as possible. I have dirt around there, but and then you can come in with another color. This is already coming off nicely. And this is a darker color. I tend to start with the lighter colors. And these are both pretty dark colors, but it's blue. And then I can put that down here. Pick up some more blue. And then get enough on there to mix. Okay. And then, depending on, you can't see that it's very dark, and then I've lightened it out here. Okay. So that red that I put in, that red earth, is mixing with that phthalo blue that I mixed in with it. And I'm getting some nice neutralization. Now I can put that then into another well. This is mixed into a dark brown. See that? It's almost a blacky brown. Let's lighten that out so you can see it has some lovely tones to it. I can put that over here, and I've isolated that color and it's the mix I want, but let's say I want it to be lighter. I can add then some water to this, and now I've got this wash of gray. So I'm not against using light paint, okay? I'm at mixing full strength so that you can then do whatever you want. Because if you mix at this strength, which is very light, you're never going to go to this. You're going to have to start remixing paint again. So you have to be strategic about it. And you do that by doing what I've just showed you. And we'll clear this off here. Which is make your paints moist by spritzing them before you start to sketch. And then putting them into two adjacent spaces, making little puddles, and putting them in maybe two adjacent places, clean places or whatever, and mixing them here from your full strength puddles. And not adding new water in until you get the color that you want. You just want a little bit lighter, then you can add more water. That's how you work strategically, and it's also how you work quickly. Because by doing this, I have this big puddle of color which I can then draw and paint a whole bear from if I'm at the zoo. and I don't have to remix and remix. Now, a lot of times I do have to remix, and I'm totally comfortable remixing. So don't sweat it. You'll learn to remix if you run out of paint, if your drawing ends up being bigger than your puddle that you have to draw from or to pull from. But it's better to have a big puddle of saturated color that you can work with and draw from. Now, this will dry down, the water will keep evaporating, and I'll be able to re-wet this. That's why I leave all these mixes on my palette. So let's do that again with something else, and we'll keep, what else can we do here? The azure is totally soft, so I can get nice paint off of that. It is a light color, but I want more water in there because while I've softened it up, I need to pull more color to make my big puddle. So you can go a little bit more saturated there. Okay. But I want that, so I can just do that. And I would use an old brush with this. And then I would take this color and I would transfer it over here. And you've seen me do this very quickly. It's second nature. You really don't think about it. Okay. That's a pretty color. I love this color. It granulates in a really nice way. So then the other color I want is, in my talking, it's already sort of dried down, so we're just going to put a little bit more color there, is this red, which you can see is very nicely saturated, but I need a little bit more water there because I want to pick up enough of it to mix with that blue. Now these colors, look, this is just as saturated as I was with my tube colors, and there was no work. There's no scrubbing. You know, there's a little bit of digging down in the pans because these are older pans, I've been using them, and you want to use an older brush for this just because you don't want your nice new, you know, $50, $60 sable brush, if you're using one, to be used for that. Now, if you have been doing this for any length of time, you will know your ratios of how much you want to put in something, and the mixing will not be like laboriously bringing from here to here to here. You'll bring one thing over and you'll get enough of what you want there, and then maybe one or two, but I wanted to just show you, keep bringing that red over to show you. But now this is a red brown, and it's got a really warm pinky undertone to it. Okay, it's much more pink in real life than it's showing up on my screen, so I'll scan that at the end. I also don't, you know, usually worry about contaminating my palettes a little bit. So this is the lighter color in this mix, and I'd start with it. Get that in there. And then I might squeeze my water brush so this goes away, or I might just wipe that on my paper towel so it mostly goes away, and then get a little water and get some of this red. And if a little contamination gets in there, I don't care. Those are strategies which you need to work and practice with to find out what works best for you as a painter. There's some painters that it's absolutely essential for them that they keep all the contamination down. And I don't see those people working in the field, quite frankly. They're studio painters. They have their 2 things of water. At the State Fair with my little table that I've been testing out before COVID, I have 2 things of water, one clear and one that's just dirty, and I'm using a real brush, and I'm trying to work out some different strategies, but it's hard to sort of break lifetime habits. But anyway, you'll see me and you'll hear me on the videos when I dip into the water. One of the reasons I do the videos in real time is so that you can actually see the drying time, but also so that you can hear me dipping in the water and so on, even if it's off screen, because you know that's what I'm doing. But a lot of times you might see me dip over here in the blue, put the blue here, and I might wipe it on a paper towel and then just dip right in the red and bring the red over here. And then there might be some blue in there. I'm not going to worry about it. When things dry, I can always go over and wipe the top and get that dirt off the top, the other colors off the top. The most important is your yellows. This I would have to clean it out like this, but I'd probably use that. I'd use that green contamination as an excuse to put that down somewhere on my paper till I got back to where it was just the yellow. You might want to stick your paper towel in it, suck all that up real quickly, and move it on your paper towel here, and that's pretty good, reasonable. Another thing you could simply do is you could travel around with a palette where you keep perhaps this upper space clean, and you put a dab of yellow up there, the one that you use for warming your white paint, for instance. So you could put a little blob of yellow here and dig into it just on the edge, and that would keep some yellow that you would have always clean. You'll find a way, the more you work, you'll find a way that you like to separate and take care of your paints. But don't be afraid of getting some contamination on the top of them. Okay? Chances are the next color that you're going to mix is going to be, if you like to use those 2 colors, is going to be the same color anyway, so it doesn't matter. Or it's going to be easy to just take off the top like it just was on that orange right there. Okay? My big bugaboos are my burnt sienna seems always to have blue in it. So you can see this is already neutralized because there's some blue in it. But since I use it basically neutralized, it's no big deal. I think it's important to find the level of tidiness that you can live with that works for you. I used to be much more tidy in the studio, and once I got watercolors that were easy because of the water brush to take out into the field, so like in the end of the 90s, I found that my outdoor palette got really messy really quickly, and I became more and more messy in the studio, unless I'm doing some really detailed type of illustration where I have my colors segregated into little pans of mixed wash, because I'm working very big and need a lot of color and don't want it to be contaminated. So again, you can use a mister, you can drop water, clean water from your brush on each of these, but with a big pan palette that's difficult, so your mister is probably your best bet to just wet this down. But you will recall it was just a couple little squeezes of water. I wasn't saturating, it was just to get a glisten. What I do then is I set that aside, I do my sketch, and I sketch. If I really want to have opaque watercolor, I'll do more water so that there will be a little standing water. So before I was just doing the glistening of it, and then if I want to actually go to opaque watercolor with watercolor, I'll maybe get more in there like that so that it is runny in there. Just a little bit. And I'll set that aside. 10 minutes it takes me to do my sketch. I go back to this. It's all nice and soft and ready to go. If you start like this, either with just a few squirts of water or a few drops of water in the colors that you know you're going to use, you don't have to do it to all of them. You can take your regular brush or your water brush and just drop a couple drops of clean water into the ones you want, or you can just spritz, in a sort of segregated range of stuff. If you do that and set it aside, by the time you're ready to go, even if it's dried a little bit, just adding a little bit more water will still get you to that really heavily concentrated water that you want if you're going to work opaquely. So again, we want to work at this level to start and to mix our stuff as we've discussed. And if you want to work opaquely, you're going to get much more. Hope there's no more water in there. Much more water in there, and let it dry. That one was almost gone. And again, lift it up and put it in a pan. And the other thing that you have to learn is, how is this stuff drying down? How is it evaporating? You might realize that you have to wait 5 minutes and mix. This is perfect now. This right here is perfect. See that? It's perfect opacity for going over these light colors. So let's say I did a raccoon and I did an underpainting of this. I go off and do other things in the painting. This dries. I can come back then and I can mix this lovely opaque watercolor, but to have an opaque mark on top of that. But it still will wash out very nicely to this steely gray. Okay? But that's from just letting it be there and evaporate. Another reason I don't clean my palette very often, because it has colors that I like to use. And a very little bit of water is going to reactivate these. See what I'm saying? That's nice. Now, if I want to get real opaque with this, I have to get all that color sort of down at the bottom and let it dry together a little bit to get it pasty again. But, nope, I don't. There we go. It's opaque enough. Your paint has a lot of range. That's what I'm trying to tell you. And I'm trying to get people to use watercolor the way it was meant to be used, which is with some slap in the face kind of saturation. That makes an interesting color there. So, and if you do this, you can always dial back to something that's very light, because you've got the big puddle of color and you can take it off your brush and put it in another slot and mix the amount of water in that you want, and so on. So it seems like it's juggling an awful lot. Maybe it is. It's a lot easier to do this than to juggle 10 color pencils in your hand, which is what I used to take out into the field in the 80s and the 90s when I didn't have a water brush, and I'm such a klutz I would have been spilling water everywhere if I tried to take regular brushes. If you drop a colored pencil when you're out in the field, unless you're in the grass, and even then it might bounce off a rock, you've got problems. You've just ruined the pencil because the lead's cracked inside. So it's going to be more problematic to use that. But here, the only thing that can happen is somebody tackles you and the palette flies out of your hand. And if you're out in the field and somebody tackles you, you have other problems besides painting. So this is way more easy than it is for colored pencils. And also colored pencils, again, I'm speaking as a colored pencil veteran who, I started colored pencil drawing when I was 9 years old, and did it faithfully for my entire life through my 30s, and then still do it, but that was like my primary medium. And I'm not knocking colored pencil as a beautiful medium, but I'm just saying having a palette in the wild or in public, a crowded public space, is a lot easier than dealing with a lot of colored pencils. A lot of colored pencils, juggling in your hands as well as your other tools if it's watercolor and so on, also makes you prime prey for any pickpocket around. Whereas if you've watched any of my videos, if you were in drawing practice with me, you see I keep a very tight footprint. And that tight footprint with all of my stuff easily gripped and around me or on me in certain ways is not going to make me a useful target for someone like that in public. And I haven't been pocketed since I was 9 years old, pickpocketed since I was 9 years old. And it only took that one time, and I thought, this is never happening to me again, because that was my hard-earned money. So, and again, this was nice and dry, but it's all that saturated color that I mixed. And now I can go in there with just very little water. What you'll do is you'll become conscious of how much water you have on your brush at any time. That's that same dark here, okay? Oops, sorry, didn't see that. That's that same dark brown as this, only this is fully saturated. I'm using it opaquely there. One of the things you might want to do now that we've sort of looked real closely at this is go back and look at some of those videos that I've done on Patreon where I'm using watercolor opaquely. I'm thinking of a cat that I did very early on. I just did this dog this month. There's a gentleman with a beard where I redrew the entire side of his face. All of those types of things. You can look and see how I'm using paint opaquely. And a lot of that is with pan color. It's a myth that you can't get saturated great color from pans, whether they're your pans that you make from your own dried color or whether they're factory pans. The key is it has to be a brand that re-wets well. Schmincke factory pans are the best factory pans that I've found. You've just seen me working with them. They're fantastic. A lot of times late at night, I don't want to traipse through the house and get other tools, and I'll just use these, and I'll still be able to paint opaquely just from these colors without the use of white, except as a highlight, not mixing with the colors, or necessarily mixing with the colors. And you've seen me reconstitute the Daniel Smith stuff. So don't listen to what other people might tell you about myths of something, better than something else or not. Brands matter, the quality of the paint matters, but tubes versus pan doesn't matter if you've got a quality brand specific to the way you're using it. Quality brand of tube paint will work as a pan, and you can do that, and I've already written about that on Roz Wound Up. I did a recent sort of reboot of all of that in one place. And these, as I've shown, okay? So you'll need a little mister like this or one of the slightly bigger ones, which I prefer, and but this was the one I could find. And then you're off and running. And I just have to say, this brown that was burnt sienna with a little bit of contamination of my phthalo blue mixed with the Parylene green, and whatever was in there that must have been a blue in there too is probably the same blue, ended up making this lovely brownie green. That's just fantastic. So you'll find things out like that too. But again, I can't state this enough. This is what you want to aim for saturation, and I've just shown you how simple it is to achieve that. So get some old brushes and start playing with this. And you know, you can use the old brush, and then let's pretend that this is a $100 brush. Red means, the red barrel means it's the $100 brush. This is the crappy old brush. You can take two brushes into the field or in the studio with you, and you can mix and scrub around in your palette with this brush. And when you get the color you want, you know, off of, you know, you can even mix it in the mixing wells. When you get the color you want on here, you can put it on this brush, having it be moist, which means I've wet it, but I've squeezed most of the water out of it. I've got dirty change water here. And then you can just brush this on. This $100 brush, it's not a $100 brush, but this is what we're pretending. This $100 brush then is all loaded and set to go. And I haven't ruined the hairs on it. Okay? It's not penny pinching. It's not trying to make do and make something last longer. What it is being respectful for the fact that you put your hard-earned money into this really expensive brush. You have no need to be scrubbing around in pans, factory-made or handmade or otherwise. Okay? In fact, you might even want to paint that way with your tube paint. Because there is something about respecting those really, really great brushes. Okay? But if you have the budget and you don't have the time, then using your $100 brush, again, we're pretending this is a $100 brush, and jamming it in the pans and picking up color and mixing it all around, well, go for it. Saves time. Well, I think I'm thinking Paddington Bear. Okay. The other thing I want you to experience is using watercolor paint the way it's meant to be used, at the saturation level it's meant to be used, so that you get a feel for how joyous it is to just move it across the paper. Working with paint like this also will make it much easier for you to build the contrast levels that you want quickly and easily. Okay? A lot of reasons to start to mix paint this way, but one is the sheer fun of it, the sheer sort of tactile fun of pushing the paint around this way. And remember, from thicker paint, you can always go down to these lighter passages by not taking more water to that area, because we want to keep this the saturation we've mixed it, by taking a little bit of this, placing it somewhere, and adding more water there until we get it the way we want it. Just think strategies. That's all it is. Write down a couple of things that you're going to try about how you're going to take your water to your palettes and sort of activate them like I've done here with the little spray bottle, and then how you're going to lift color and put it in other places, and start practicing with one of these things, one at a time, seeing how they work for you. And then take it from there. That's how we grow really good habits, and that's how we learn to work with our paints so that they're saturated as we need them for the things that we want to paint, the subject matter, and the atmosphere we want to create. Remember, you can go really, really light with all these mixes. But you need to start with enough paint to make it fun, worthwhile, and achievable. Go give this a try. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.